Welcome to This Is Fine, the podcast that takes a lighthearted approach to discussing all things tech and cybersecurity. I'm your host and CEO of Hunter Strategy, Matt Treiner, here to navigate the murky waters of pen testing with a panel of experts who are anything but green when it comes to pen testing. Today, we're joined by AJ King, the CISO at Hunter Strategy, our mastermind behind Hunter's cybersecurity consulting practice. Next up, we have Jake Williams, the VP of R&D here at Hunter Strategy, and the brains behind our new cybersecurity products and services. And last but certainly not least, we have special guest Joshua Marpet, the Chief Compliance Officer of Cyturus, a cybersecurity expert renowned for his work in tackling government corruption, bad compliance, and protecting mission-critical data. Welcome, gentlemen.
And I just want to point out Joshua's got Risk Warlock, which I'm now jealous of. I like that a lot. Even though Risk Warlocks bring things back from the dead, so like I don't want Risk coming back from the dead.
That's
like,
Risk Necromancer.
Okay. Maybe. Okay.
Yeah. So way back in the day, this is in 97, right? I briefly, for like a 3 or 4 month period, Warlock was actually one of the call signs that we had. So this, of course, I see Risk Warlock and I'm like, right? So
all the memories come back.
One of the team call signs, right? So it's like, okay, cool, I guess, yeah.
So my question now is, Joshua, like Warlocks have pets, right? And you seduce Risk, or you banish it, or like what are you doing with Risk here, buddy?
I understand.
All right.
So I want to kick off here challenging some common assumptions, right? The term pen test can mean a lot of different things to different people, from some people taking a vulnerability scan of external offensive vulnerabilities and call that a pen test. And other people use the term red team exercises and pen tests interchangeably. So if everyone could start off, and I'll start with you, AJ, what's a widespread misconception about pen testing that you've encountered, and how would you use this forum to make the record straight?
Sure. From a client perspective, one of the biggest things, that you can look at and think of is most clients think that a pen test is a super wide, 100% representative, 100% descriptive, right, of all the state of their environment. Hey, our pen test said we're clean. Look, we're clean. And in most cases, what that means is that you are not clean necessarily. It could mean you are clean, right? But in a lot of cases, clients downscope from a budget perspective the amount of time that you have to work on a particular environment. And as a environment matures over time, it's naturally going to get harder and harder, or should, theoretically speaking, get harder and harder to penetrate into, right? So that needs to be understood as your environment matures. And so lots of clients look at this and they say, well, we had a pen test, right? It says no critical high findings, right? We're good. We're solid. Our environment's good. And so that to me would be probably one of the number one misconceptions that's out there. But do you want me to follow up that with how would I use this forum to fix that?
I would.
Okay. How would I use this forum to fix that? Which really comes down to, it's all about scoping your pen test and understanding where your critical assets lie. Where do you want the laser beam to be focused at effectively? If you have to scope down your penetration test for whatever reason, for budget, otherwise, make sure that you understand that and you're able to report back and speak on that. Make sure that you're selecting a vendor that will work with you and understand how to appropriately use the time that you have allocated and the budget that you have allocated to target the things that benefit your environment the most. And it's very much, in my opinion, like going and seeing a doctor, right, from an annual physical. It's like, they're like, hey, do you have anything specific that you want to talk about at this particular time? It's like, yeah, doc, I've been having chest pains. We're like, oh my God, right? So it's go and find the right doctor, go and make sure you understand the context, and make sure that you understand it's not a one-time thing that says, yep, we're good. The physical says we're good.
So that's a pretty good answer. I'm going to toss this over to Josh because I'm curious to get other perspective. I don't think anyone here is going to disagree with that answer, but what's another good example of a misconception around pen testing?
Everything. And here's the problem. And I've done this exercise, go talk to 2 or 3 dozen pen testers and ask them what a pen test is, and you're going to get 2 or 3 dozen different answers. Okay? And the problem is that nobody actually knows. Because you talk to somebody that comes out of a pen test puppy mill, and they're going to tell you, oh, you scrubbed the Nessus logo off, and that's a pen test. You go talk to somebody that absolutely specializes in ICS, SCADA, IoT, OT, whatever you want to call it this week, pen tests, And they're going to say, I break into the firmware of that device, that PLC, and then I get into the CNC machines and I steal the engineering drawings and I have won, and that's a pen test. And you talk to somebody that does full scope red team exercises, and they're going to be like ninja scaling walls and crap, going through the garbage dumpsters, kidnapping people and holding the $5 XKCD wrench to their head, whatever. But the point is that they have a very different conception of what a pen test is. And so all of these are pen tests at some various level of the word. But AJ brought up a good point. Is a pen test a holistic view of your environment? Maybe, but maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I want to know what the single worst thing about my environment is. That's a very focused pen test. Maybe I want an overall holistic view of my environment to show me where all of the open windows and doors, metaphorically speaking, are, and where I can focus some of my effort, my dollars, my budget, my people, whatever, to close them, and to make myself more of an imposing facade over a very nice little crunchy soft core. Okay, whatever. The point is that a pen test is different things to different people, and we have to account for that. And that is probably one of the biggest problems we have, because and I'm going to rant. I apologize. I hope that's okay. But as an industry, the fact that we do not have definitions of what we say mean that when I say pen test and when Jake hears pen test, he may hear something, and I'm just going to pick on Jake because I can.
He hasn't gone yet, so that's fair. You at least picked on the person who has an opportunity to respond next to the same question.
See, I'm polite. But he may hear something very different than what I meant. Until you and I can talk apples to apples and understand that the words we're saying mean the same thing, as a profession, we're screwed. And by the way, I don't mean that we will not be able to perform a pen test properly. I mean that as a profession, we're screwed. We are going to see the commoditization and specialization and lowering the salaries of our profession because we cannot communicate effectively, either with each other or with the executives that sign those magic things called paychecks.
So I'm curious, I don't want to interrupt, but I want to ask a question on that, because there are some standards out there, and it almost feels like a large portion of this.
Name them.
Well, no, that's my point. There are a ton of them from a standards perspective. Like PTES may be an example.
I got commit access to PTES. We're revamping it now.
Right. So my point being is it's almost as an industry, it's that and I'm speaking metaphorically, but my ego believes that I know more. I have a different approach to pen testing, or a better approach to pen testing than you do. So I'm going to go spin up my own standard, right, and get a bunch of people behind it. And before you know it, we have 15 fragmented standards. So.
XKCD, by the way, has a one about that too.
That was my first thought. There's a couple of those. Yeah.
We have a unified standard. There's now 16.
We got to figure out a format where we just float the XKCD reference beneath the screen in post.
Yeah.
But the point is that we need to get together as an industry, and we need to come up with a set of definitions for the words and the things that we say. When we can do that, we can do other things. Now, I'm not going to mention licensure, so I'm not going to discuss it. I'm not going to mention I will mention professionalism. But how can we claim to be professionals when we literally can't communicate properly? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make an offer. The AID conference in West Virginia is happening. I'm going to invite all three of you to it because we are actually getting together at that conference, a group of us, and we're going to start defining those terms for the industry. We have commit access to PTES. We're going to be modifying PTES. We're going to be modifying every standard there is that we can get our hands on to be a single standard, a universal standard, and one that the people that are actually involved in it, like y'all, actually have input on.
Cool.
I appreciate that. But first off, I think that there's a wealth of value in standards. I want to challenge the notion that we absolutely need them from a penetration testing standpoint, because PTES, as much as I love it, and I think it's a fantastic standard. Now, don't get me started on things that sound like toothpaste. Gosh, I can't think of the name here. I certainly don't want to, defame them or anything. But, in fact, if you don't know, right, then research this and see the cancer that is across the UK and Singapore, et cetera, to that industry. all that said, right? While I love standards, I do think that the industry is so broad and so different that trying to apply a set of standards to, for instance, you think about generally accepted accounting practices. That's because there's only one way to keep books. We come in and we say pen test. The term itself means so much to so many people. When someone comes in and asks me, Jake, what is a pen test? The answer is whatever the client wants it to be. Now, it's my job as a professional to guide them to getting value out of that, out of those resources that they're spending. But at the end of the day, I think the client drives the definition a bit, and does so through scoping, which of course is one of the biggest challenges, as AJ brought up, coming full circle here.
Can I challenge you a little?
Please, yeah.
So the client does not get to define what a pen test is. They get to define what they want to cover, the scoping, as you said,
That's fair. Yeah.
in the pen test. Now, a pen test shouldn't have a single definition. If you thought that I meant that this is a pen test, no. What I mean is that there should be a definition so that I can define on client site. And Josh Moore actually wrote out a beautiful definition of a pen test because, by the way, P-TES doesn't define pen test. Just to be clear, I have the definition they were going to put in that they never did. They never defined pen test. A pen test has dimensions and attributes. It can be this broad in scope or this narrow in scope. It can be take this long or this long. There's various aspects, sliders on a music producing board.
Sure.
You change the sliders and certain other sliders change because of it. And when the pattern of sliders that you come up with at the end is their pen test for them for that instance. Are we okay with that, Jake? Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah, sure. I'll work with that.
Okay. So you're right. I agree with you. There's no one definition of it. But we need to be able to agree that when I say, hey, this client's doing a pen test, you go, okay, tell me about the dimensions and the attributes. And I describe where the sliders are. You're like, I got you. We're good. Okay? Because, and here's the kicker, there are certain aspects that are outside the definition of pen test. If I run Nessus, and I'm picking on Nessus, it's a great vuln scanner, but it's not a pen test.
Concur.
Would you agree that it's not a pen test?
Oh, 100% concur. Yep.
Okay. We're on the same page there. Would you agree that
it's an element of the recipe that is a pen test?
I am totally fine with that. But on its own, it is not a pen test. It's a vuln scan.
Yeah.
How about an exploitability scanner, an automated scanner to check exploitability of vulnerabilities? Is that a pen test?
I would argue generally no, but I'm positive there are some vendors that are going to disagree with that.
Oh,
I'm
I
just
can name
waiting
a
for-
couple of DoD red teams that would also.
They're wrong.
Well, that's
An
that's what we're here to talk about.
But they're right as well, depending on how deep the exploitability scanner goes. The exploitability
Let
scanner.
me back up for just a second there, right? Because this is something that I really get amped about is when somebody says, well, you
Brother.
exploited a vulnerability, but you didn't take post-exploitation activity, therefore that's not pen test activity. Because that sounds to me like every web app pen test that I do, or not every, but the majority of web app pen tests that I do, I'm not taking post-exploitation actions, right? I'm doing vulnerability discovery, in the web app. And so using that as a straw man, using web app pen testing as a straw man, I don't see how confirming that a vulnerability exists and exploiting it without taking, or depending on how deep we go, I don't see how that's different. And that's where I get into, looking and saying, hey, I think it gets dangerous when we start
saying, no, it's not. Yeah. When you start locking off, this is not a pen test. This is not a pen test. This is not a pen test. Then you
problems
start
out of what you define. It's in the analogy or the analogous situations that are not explicitly defined. And that's where,
So-
heck, 2 weeks from now, we'll be back on the stand in federal court, right? As you well know, that relies very heavy, or testimony like that relies very heavily on standards.
Yep.
And as we go and define and say, lop something off and say, this is not a pen test, I think that's going to create a lot of liability for a lot of practitioners that frankly, forgive me, I find a bit unnecessary, right, to create. But I do see the other side of the coin too.
No. But I wanted to make a point here. A vulnerability scanner, I think we can all agree, can be an element of a pen test, but should not be termed as a pen test in and of itself. Okay? Because there is no exploitability or exploitability checking in any way, shape, or form, right? So I think we can say that an element of a pen test should be exploitability checking. So can I have a pen test that says, find my vulnerabilities, check if they're exploitable, and do nothing else? Is that a pen test? And you just said, Jake, that in my web app pen tests, that's basically some of the things that you do, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Scope. Yeah.
And so that can be termed as a pen test. So an exploitability scanner can be a pen test. For one definition of a pen test, yes. Does that mean that if I am mandated to do a pen test by framework XYZ, whatever it is, that an exploitability scanner is automatically accepted as the pen test for that regulatory framework? And the answer is no, it depends. Wouldn't you agree?
Ooh.
It depends on what the regulatory framework intended. If the regulatory framework intended that you needed to show post-exploitation activity, you need to show not just, and I'm going to analogize here for a minute.
Is there a regulatory framework that does that gets that
No.
deep?
No.
Not one that I'm aware of.
Oh,
That's
really?
what I would come back to. Would be I don't think that any regulatory framework in the world goes and says this is what you should do. They like if it's just compliance based that you must have penetration testing.
Right. And but that to I think to the lack of standardization, right, leaves a lot of room for what you consider to cover as, as a pen test. But I don't view that necessarily as a bad thing, because look, anytime we create a standard, one of the things that we see consistently is regression to the mean, right, or regression to the minimum here with standards.
The lowest common denominator. Absolutely.
100%. That is where Josh, when you started talking about sliders earlier, I'm like, well, if you have a compliance slider on there, that's the only slider that anybody's going to touch.
That's it.
In my opinion, I shouldn't say the only one, right? But 90% of the people are just going to be like, compliance slider, the rest of it I don't care about, right?
And that's true.
Because in most cases, that's what they're measured against.
You're absolutely correct. And that is the problem, is that everybody goes, what's the cheapest way that I can check the damn box? Right?
So I think our message here, right, is one of when the audience that we're speaking to, right, is one of how should you, right, and I'm speaking to the audience right now, right, how should you as a security director, as an infrastructure director, right, as a CISO, whatever, be viewing a penetration test, and what should your thought process be to it? How should you be advocating against it? How should you be measuring it, scoping it, all of those things, right? Like, I think that's the intention here, right?
If you're a CISO at a public company, your only concern is getting the cheapest thing that will check the box, because otherwise you're stealing shareholder value, period.
Well, wait.
Okay,
No.
I want to challenge that. I want to challenge. Again, while certainly every single person here has met that CISO. Shit, I've advised that CISO, right? So it's not to say that they don't exist, and I think the only argument to have is whether that's the majority or the minority or how much of the majority, and that's a different conversation than does it exist. It's how many of them exist, and that's a little more
Matt is practically backpedaling to stay off of that one.
Right.
But
Well,
anyway,
I don't think that's what we're here to talk about. But what I will say is that when anybody that's experienced a breach, anybody that has lost shareholder value, and this is a quote from Jake that I use a lot. I'm pretty sure it's a Jake original, but it might not be. Is threat actors get a say in what the standard deviation looks like, and so
shareholder value, so it doesn't matter.
But again, it's an argument. But I disagree, because I think there's plenty of CISOs that'll say, I need to balance the risk of what I don't test against the cost of what I do test.
Yeah.
And that's the shareholder value maximization when you've understood because this is a legal thing I hear all the time. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of remediation. And I can tell, and you can, there's a million of those analogies, right? It's really a lot cheaper to come up with an asset inventory using a blue team exercise than it is to pay your D for people to do it. Right, because either way, you're gonna get it, and so
easier, but it's definitely less expensive, right?
Well, I think it's both easier and less expensive, but I understand the distinction you're making.
Less urgency at the very least on the front end, rather than that.
That's a fair point. Well, easy is a relative term, so I get that. I get where AJ's picking at, but that's why I say that I think that. To both of your points, and AJ said this too, compliance is the slider people will care about, and that's the point that you made also. But I don't know that pushing the slider to the right for everybody, and by the right, I'm just referring to the more conservative approach, is necessarily the best way to get that balance between the risk of what you don't test versus the cost of what you do. And one thing that came to my mind that I would like to pose as a question here, because I don't think any compliance framework does this today, and I could be wrong. I know a bunch, but I don't know them all. Is it would be really interesting to argue or to require a person scoping the pen test to document the value to the org and the coverage it's providing. And the reason I think of that is because I did our ISO 27001, and I'm calling out Hunter here, but it said get a pen test. We were doing a very quick exercise because a proposal required it. And we have, in my opinion, one of the better security postures than a lot of organizations. And I can say that because we've been resilient to many attempts on our network. But at the same time, when we went to just check the certificate box, they were like, well, the assessor was like, let's do a pen test of your website. And I'm thinking, well, that's an S3 bucket fronted by CloudFront. So go for it, guys. That's going to go great, right? And there was no requirement that I demonstrate that this pen test materially helps the blue team, materially plugs gaps, materially represents a part of my enterprise. I didn't have to show materiality of that pen test. I just had to have a pen test. And I think materiality is going to depend on your assessor. It's not like I don't think there's going to be a single way to define materiality, but I think that forcing people to think about it and document it, which will help in discovery if you are breached of, well, what was your last pen test and what was your argument of the material nature of it, that's going to at least embarrass enough CISOs into thinking, well, shit, I really need to justify why the scope is what it is, and document that. I just, again, literally, this is a thought with no preparation. So I'm curious if that's an answer to this very difficult problem here.
There's a lot of assumptions that we're all talking about, and we're not recognizing them as assumptions. Does a breach cause shareholder value loss? By the way, the answer is no.
Depends, I think, but I understand. I've definitely seen cases where that wasn't true. So I look at CrowdStrike's price, and it wasn't a breach; it was a fault. But CrowdStrike's price now compared to CrowdStrike is a good counterexample to shashareholder value understanding.
It doesn't automatically cause shareholder value loss, right? Is what he's saying.
No. I'm actually saying that 90%. I think it's 90 to 95% of breaches cause no shareholder value loss in the long term. In the short term, yes. In the long term,
how?
So listen, I'm not going to argue that the share price is what the share price is, and I understand that shareholder value, but these are expenses. The breaches have significant expenses that divert revenue elsewhere. It's not. I mean, look, at the end of the day, operating capital is zero sum. That's just math. That's not arguable.
No, I agree.
And so the money that you're spending responding to breaches and increases in cyber insurance premiums and is not going into research and development. It's not going into, I think it's disingenuous to hear, because I hear the argument a lot, but I typically hear it from business people, not from cybersecurity folks, that shareholder value isn't impacted just because the share price stays relatively flat, right, or doesn't go down. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't have gone up absent those costs. And I just don't see, given the zero-sum nature of operating capital, how you can divert, in many cases, massive amounts of operating capital.
This is not the central tenet of this discussion, but I will address your point, Jake, very quickly. No offense, but you're 100% wrong. Let me explain.
Okay.
So first off, share price tends to go down just after a breach, and then it actually rises above where it was. So you actually gain in shareholder value for share price alone. In terms of operating capital, how many times have you been in front of a CISO, even a jail, and had them go, what is the percentage or chance that we're going to get breached this year? And you're like, how the hell am I supposed to know that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So they go, well, then we're not going to spend on the $1 million. I'm making numbers up. The $1 million you're asking for these protective measures. on the systems, because if you can't tell me a percent, I can't spend the money. And it may not be the CISO doing that. Maybe it's the CIO or the CEO, but you get the idea. The problem is that you're making false assumptions. You're saying you're either going to spend a few bucks now or a lot of dollars later.
No,
right?
no. Never said that. I want to be super clear. I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form. That's
I misunderstood.
I would never tell a client that a pen test is a good prevention for being breached. It's exactly what it is. It's an identification of, at that point in time, for the stuff tested, right, or for the scope of the test, right, vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and potentially, if in scope, post exploitation activities, right, that result from those. It doesn't in any way, shape, or form, indicate that you won't get breached, or even potentially reduce the likelihood of.
But EDR and IDS and SIM or SIEM and whatever, all the expenses that you could go to now, which by the way, to me are table stakes, but that's a different question. But instead of spending the money on those things, let's put the money into the bottom line, because that's where my executive bonus comes from, baby. Okay. And then on the other hand of it, but if we get breached, we're going to spend 50 times that, 10 times that, 100 times that, whatever it is, on the response, on the defer people, right? Okay. And you're 100% right. But the problem is, without the quantification of risk and the proper timeline of risk, what we have is a failure to communicate with the executives on when that money should be spent. And remember that with the lifespan of a typical CISO being 18 months and their actual job title being designated scapegoat, do we actually have CISOs that give a crap because they're hoping they'll be out of there before the breach actually happens? Now, am I disagreeing with you? I'm not, so long as you have a CISO or an executive team, whatever you want to call it, that is invested in the long-term strategic strength and health of the company, including the cybersecurity. Barring that, which in this age of my view span is 1 quarter, we have much fewer of those than we used to. Does that make more sense?
Without debating that, let's circle back into the pen testing space, right? Because I know we want to cover some of the because this would we could is a great adult beverage discussion for another time.
Yeah.
So
you understand where I'm coming from. That's all I'm asking. Does that make sense?
I do understand where you're coming from. I guess on the pen test side, I do still see the number one challenge. I actually agree 100% with AJ on this. That the number one challenge we see is scoping, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely agreed.
And that we routinely, and this is one of the things that I think differentiates the as you mentioned, pen test puppy mills from the better pen testing firms is guidance in scoping. Right, the customer is not always right because the customer isn't always educated on what they need.
Which is what our standards that have scope in them. For example, PCI says that here's your cardholder data environment. You must pen test that. Okay. So, and I'm sorry, please continue. I agree.
I think that's the biggest differentiator I think not any, right? But there are a much broader set of individuals who can go deliver and execute on a given pen test, given the scope, than there are people like AJ, right, who can go out and help directly scope a pen test. When the client shows up and says, here's what I need, and AJ's like, I understand what you think you need. Here's the, and oftentimes they're correct, right? And other times it's like, hey, gently, you may be missing things here. Do you want to consider those? And it's that advice. And AJ, I want to bring you back in on this. Thoughts?
Wait. I got one thing. Matt, do you have a car?
Do I have a car?
Yes.
I have a couple.
Okay. When you take your favorite car, the minivan, into the garage, all right, what's the hardest thing to find at a garage?
I think you're making a very strong assumption, which is that I don't have so much shit in my garage that I can fit my car in there. Because that is you have children and little children. I think you should know better than to assume that I can fit my car in the garage.
When you bring your car to a service location, a mechanic shop, do you know what the hardest thing to find at a service garage is?
10mm socket.
Yeah, that's true. That's actually very true.
all the car guys will appreciate that joke, right? So.
I got it, 100%. Yes.
Hardest thing to find.
Walk away.
There's easy to find wrench turners. It's hard to find a diagnostician. And Jake, I'm backing up your argument.
Yeah.
I can find web app pen testers that are GPen certified all day, all day, all day. Okay, I can find toothpaste certified. I can find, shade tree mechanics all day. But finding a diagnostician who can say your scope is off, who can say your level that you want to do this is off, who can say here are the aspects that are wrong of what you're asking for, and let's sit down and talk about it. That's rare. That's why AJ is very rare. Okay.
Well, I think what it comes back to is a little bit of what we were talking about earlier in the standard side of things, and where I view the standards as valuable is we all know, that there are a lot of people that are responsible for purchasing, scoping pen tests that have no idea what their actual intended outcome should be, right?
Right.
And so to me, that's where like the standards come in to help, because you can say, hey, use this standard as a baseline and make sure that whatever vendor you're speaking with, that you're inquiring with, as you go about setting up and scoping your process, these are the things that you should care about. Because let's use your example, Josh, which just it basically says, hey, PCI, you have to perform penetration testing. Right. And so what does a company do? I mean, we've got a client right now that has a PCI environment and has a corporate network environment, right? So all they're going to pen test is the PCI environment, and they don't pen test the corporate environment, right? Because as Jake said, you slide towards the minimum, right? Everybody slides towards the minimum, right? And so in reality, what it really needs to be is it needs to be a viewpoint shift, right? As well as CISOs, directors of IT, all of those things, right? Understanding and being empowered and understanding how to go and have those communications. And one of the biggest things that I'm seeing is, frankly, that there's a lack of experienced executives. And I don't want to even say executive, but how do you go? And I've said this for a long time, that InfoSec in general sucks at selling. Like, we suck at giving our value prop to the people that have to make the decisions, right? And so it's like, our objective here should be, we're teaching people via standards, via otherwise, this is how you go make your value prop. This is how you scope it left. And to your point you said earlier, which I agree with, without risk quantification, there isn't really any way to make proper decisions on impact on wherever you want to go. So, but I will again tell you, out of the mouth of one of our client CEOs, within the last 60 days, right, they're like, wow, well, this really sucks. All the money that we spent for the last 2 years on what we thought was development from a product perspective now has to go to this, $3 million IR ransomware response.
And you're 100% correct. And I love what you said. I really do. And the point is that you mentioned something. There's a lack of execs or management or whatever you want to call it that can communicate what needs to be done to properly test and secure an environment, right? Can we all agree on that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, Jake, are you good with that?
Sure.
Everybody heard it? It's now in court. We're good. We're done. Okay. But the point is that, and I agree with you, by the way, there is a lack of people, and I'm going to add on to it. There's a lack of people that can communicate, incentivize, and be incentivized by, here's what you need to do to properly test, secure, investigate, whatever your environment. Okay? So if we have that problem, then we need to give them a framework to communicate with. And that's why I'm saying we need definitions.
I would agree. I guess what I think some of the point that Jake was trying to make, though, and again, this is not a well thought out line of thinking, but our regulatory environment has to change, right? Like, because that is at the end of the day what is ultimately driving the minimum behavior is the regulatory environment, right? And it's like, you can't, if you're an auto company, you can't opt out of, right, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration rules, right? You can't just be like, yep, I don't want to do that, right? Sorry, you don't get to be in business, right? So there has to be some approach along those lines, right, as it comes to penetration testing that is going to drive that minimum mean behavior up, right?
It is. When you start thinking about the fact that things like CMMC, when you start thinking about the fact that there are standards that are not necessarily specifying what type of pen test or the scoping or whatever, but when you start thinking about the fact that they're starting to do supply chain risk management in larger and larger scale, and the fact that they're starting to rely on I'm going to use government contracting terminology for a minute. It applies most of the time. You start thinking that they're talking about the primes mandating that the subs actually say, okay, you're going to meet this standard and you're going to do these things, and here's our policy. You need to match that policy in order to be one of our subcontractors, et cetera. So you've got entire value chains, entire supply chains that are looking at each other and going, "You're going to be cool with this? No, you have to do this." There are starting to be standards, not so much as written into the standard, but written into the what did they call it? The implication. And I forget what is that from Friends? I forget.
No,
Anyway,
the is from It's Always Sunny, and it doesn't mean
Sunny.
anything good.
But there's a supply chain aspect here, or a value chain aspect here, in that you've got a value chain sort of social peer pressure to meet and match what everybody is doing. That is starting to ramp up with software bill of materials, with pen tests, with hardware bill of materials, various different aspects that are coming together. It's very nascent. It's very in its infancy, but I'm seeing that.
Yeah.
In things like CMMC, where it's very data focused, and so it's starting to write pieces of their standards that are starting to be written. I'm privy to that I can't talk about very much, but that are starting to standardize on. You need to be able to protect against this and this and this. You need to test to make sure that you can protect against this and this and this. They're not telling you how to pen test. They're telling you sort of to the level of pen test that you have to go. And I know that's a little shaky, and I apologize.
No, that's
Well,
fine.
no, so I actually, spinning out of this, right? I very much like because we could argue this is some level of pen testing depending on your definitions, right? But the EU product liability directive, right, that was just passed, late last year. I say passed late last year. I guess well, it doesn't matter. The EU's dumb. And so there's the stages, right? So somewhere between October and December, and will be in law in the next 2 years, in member countries. But it talks about, and I very much like the way it was written, because it says, that as an affirmative defense, effectively, that you use the state of the art techniques at the time, right? That the product was released, and they're very clear that that's not what you consider state of the art. It's what the industry considers state of the art. And so I do think that there's a bit of one, I think regulatory regimes introducing liability are going to change a bit of security testing anyway, right? Which again, we can argue it does that fall into pen testing, product pen testing, what have you. But and of course, the EU product liability directive for connected devices includes the services behind them, which definitely is in scope for pen testing, and would also fall under the same regulatory regime of state of the art techniques. I I think this is by and large going to be solved by. I hate to come back to regulation, because I'm not a please give me more regulation guy, but I think this
Either.
problem gets solved with regulation, and I like the way that they define that in a not in a minimalist way, right, but in a very maximalist way, right, to say that unless you're doing what is considered everything that's considered state of the art, then you've opened yourself up to liability. The only way, right, that you're out of liability, right, under regulation and eventually under the law, is conforming to state of the art. And I think that's how we end up with, instead of defining minimum standards, right, which again, just we already know how that plays out, right? Defining, basically and saying, hey, like, you either do the best as we know it at the time, or you're subject to potential liability. I think that actually is going to bear out well.
So let's
I
take
agree with
that.
you. Define
I
the
agree with you too, just to be clear. But let's take that line of thought and let's turn it into kind of a little bit of a recommendation, right? As we think about what does state of the art mean today, right? So
Mhm.
I'm a director of IT, right? And I'm trying to scope my penetration test. And one of the things, Jake, that you and I talked about actually several months ago when I was ranting at you when we talked about this podcast topic, right, was the difference between like what the objective, right, of a penetration test is, right?
Mhm.
And I recognize that I'm not going to necessarily put this into industry standard terms, but from my perspective as a CISO, right, if I'm hiring someone to penetration test my environment, the objective for me is, can you get privilege and materially impact and change my environment, right? Like, and almost you could literally say that privilege doesn't matter. Can you do something that materially impacts my environment, right?
Right.
That's
But
it. Yeah.
in most cases, it means you have to get privilege, right? In most cases, it means that you have to then turn and perform post-exploitation activities, right? To me, a list of vulnerabilities that you've identified in my environment and then, said, hey, yes, I can exploit that. When it comes to things like network penetration testing, is not is to me is not indicative of that's a vuln scan, right? To me, right? And so when I'm talking to our team, our objective is always get the highest level of privilege that you can, right? And if I'm giving advice to a director of IT, to a CISO, whatever it may be, it's like, well, what are the things that you care about, right? Where's the crown jewels, right? And regardless of what your crown jewels are, domain admin is crown jewels, like period dot, right? Like, so across the environment, so you can really take that as a boundary and say, really, anytime someone gets domain admin, it's how many paths can you cut to domain admin, right?
Yeah.
So and the reminder that a penetration test is literally a snapshot in time, right? It is a moment in time that existed. Maybe we came in and tested you the day after Microsoft patches dropped. I don't know, right? Maybe an example, right?
Wait. Pen tests aren't valid for 364 days? Oh my God.
So my question back to you is, what's your, in the few minutes we have left, what's your top advice when you're advising, right, an IT director or CISO, and they're saying, man, I've only got X amount of budget. What's the maximum way that I can help scope this, right, to be maximally effective?
I mean, okay, so I'll take it. So understand what you have. If you don't understand what you have, you can't protect it. So that means if you're worried about data exfiltration, then you need to do a pen test around where your data is and where your data is used. If you're worried about changes to your environment, then you need to worry about privilege escalation, and you need to worry about a Mimikatz or a Kerberos attack of some sort. If you're worried, or remote code execution, or a dozen different places, whatever. It depends on what you do, what you have, and where you have it at. If you're worried about somebody breaking it, like what's your top 5 worries, and design your pen test around that. And that's the real key. If you and by the way, that doesn't mean that your scoping is only those 5 or whatever. That means that's the focus of what type of pen test and what type of concerns you address with the company. By the way, going right back to Jake's point, that a quality company will sit down with you beforehand and go, hey, what are your concerns? And if you can go da 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 da, you know what, that pen test just became 1,000% more valuable. Okay? Because they have a clear idea of what your concerns are. You know that they're interested in following what your concerns are, and that they're going to focus and customize the pen test around that, and that you can actually get something quality done to address. Unless you're a monstrous company, you don't have the money for a pen test to check everything. You just don't. Okay? And even the monstrous companies don't do it because it's not worth their damn time. But if you have the money to have a good pen test done, then have a good pen test done. Here are my top 3 or my top 5 concerns. Here's the things that worry me, that keep me up at night, that would put me on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in a bad way. Okay? Please address those.
Jake, I'm curious your take. Or Matt. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, Matt.
Jake, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, just high level here. I don't disagree with that. It's focus on concerns, right? Because again, you can't test everything, or certainly can't test everything to this, to any
Depth,
high assurance level, right? Within most budgeting. So you focus again, where the biggest targets are. And for me, generally, all things equal, right, where I start is always external attack surface, right? Because it's just base rate. It's the most likely to be exploited. The second thing that I do is, look, phishing is, forgive me, phishing tests are worthless. If you disagree with me, please show me the data. Show me the data that says that literally that tracks an outcome, because Kevin Mitnick, God rest his soul, right, had the data to show it, and would not have been able to shut up about it if the data showed that phishing tests reduced actual or created better security outcomes. We aren't hearing about it. It doesn't. So land me, the pen tester, right, inside the environment with a regular non-privileged account and then test from there. And again, the goal is not necessarily achieving domain admin. I share with folks regularly that one of my biggest impacts to an organization where they're like, holy goodness, we'd have lost the farm here. Is a large chain, a large retail chain where I landed sadly, they demanded phishing emails. I landed one, and it was for a regular line worker in the printing office, and was able to go access from that years of print jobs, including from a big law firm, and like an internationally known law firm that had sent the jobs to them for printing and binding and what have you. This required no domain admin, right? And I did get domain admin, right? But it was the finding of the pen test that literally by dropping in with any, anybody's identity that worked in this print shop that you're
Does anybody else
exfiltrating.
respect the fact that Jake just went as an aside? Oh, I mean, I did get domain admin, but that's not the important bit.
It's not the important part, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't at all the important part. In fact, it was the literal minutes between landing a phishing email and exfiltrating the first, put you on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, data, right? That wasn't detected either. So again, I'm kind of in that boat of external attack surface, then drop somebody in, with a regular domain user account and see what they do from there and what you detect.
The only thing I'm going to add to that before the caveat that's, and you and I talked about this, which is if all you do is the external attack surface one and you don't do the internal one and you think that you have gotten a penetration test and that you're good now, you're lighting your money on fire, right?
Correct.
Because again, what do we say? It's high 90%, right, of endpoints that's compromises that start on an endpoint, right? Everybody talks about 0 days and Avanti this and Avanti that, but the vast majority of the time, right, it's a phishing email. It's somebody installing something from a website, right, or something similar. So if you're testing from the outside and you're not doing an assumed breach, you're lighting your money on fire.
Wait, the Bonzi buddy is bad? Oh God! Oh no!
Last question I want to ask: if you had to spend 50 grand on a penetration test or 50 grand on dividing that up over the course of the year for a red team engagement, which one's more value?
I know my answer. Jake, do you want to take it first?
It's valuable, man. Now I got to define value, right? Because from a compliance perspective, pen test 100%. If you're talking about for actual security value, it's not even close, right? I'm gonna. But again, this is such an artificial discussion because I don't want to move into red teaming until we've got the bases covered.
Yep. Understood.
Although I've been called in repeatedly, right, to do red teaming for clients, as have you, who don't have baseline penetration testing done, and oftentimes that's being used as a shock and awe kind of campaign. We can debate the value of that, but it works in a lot of cases, right? Where that does open up the more funding. Whereas pen test, I don't think I've ever seen pen test open up more funding. Red team, 100%.
Really damn good point about the more funding. I want to point out, Jake, that was actually a brilliant point. And so my answer, honestly, was going to be I'd rather take that 50 grand and turn it into a purple teaming exercise.
Thank you.
To train the blue team and get them up to speed on what's going on in the world of red teaming, to get them up to speed on detection, to give them more confidence, to have them have a fun time, and to get them willing to talk to people to say, hey, I think there's something weird here. Can I call you in as a resource to check this with me? That to me is the most valuable use you can put that money to. And by the way, you want to call that a pen test. I'm totally cool with that because you have people attacking. Okay? That works for me. I'm much happier with that because honestly, that is bringing up the confidence and the capabilities of everybody all the way around. So Jake, I think I'm backing you up on this. Are we?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
I'm down with it.
Yeah.
So I want to, just because I know we're kind of up on time here, so I want to take a couple of conclusions out for everyone listening, which is one, and this is just a reference, is scope is technically also a dental word, and that wasn't the one we were talking about, without defaming anybody. Second, I think we've heard that the lack of standardization does create confusion in terms of what is the right value. And while
Yep.
we can debate, and we did debate maybe a little too long about what the right amount of standardization is, that a lack of standardization results in what I've called, and I realize I'm too old to call, the my cousin Vinny conversation, where they're admitting to stealing a can of tuna fish, but the sheriff is asking them if they murdered the guy, and everyone's thinking, "Yep, we're talking about the same thing. I'm feeling really good about this conversation right now." And then one guy thinks he's going to get up and return a can of tuna fish, and instead we get an amazing movie from the '90s. As long as that's the outcome every time, I guess that's fine, but that's rarely the outcome when people are talking past each other. The other part that we talked about is what is value and how do you define value in terms of security and in terms of spending money on penetration. And that's if that's not part of the discussion with your pen test vendor, then you probably don't have the right pen test vendor. And that was the pen test puppy mill comment that was made before, is that there are many companies, and by the way, lots of great dogs come out of puppy mill. So I'm not even knocking on the concept of growing people up and doing it, but some people think that that's enough, right? Just we have the talent farm, we teach them how to use Nessus, and we can just churn out more pen tests than anybody else. Might drive a lot of dollars, so I'm not necessarily knocking on somebody else's business, but I'm here to make a recommendation to people that are listening. And my recommendation is, if you're not having the conversation about value and what's important to achieve, then you're probably doing it with the wrong vendor, or don't have the intelligence on your side to ask those questions, and probably should be seeking consultative help when performing the scoping and analysis. And so that, and the last thing is, and this might be a deeper study that I do, I would really like to understand, we talked a little bit about shareholder value before, and what does that really mean? And Jake's point about operating costs and revenue is just math. There's really no question to that for me. But I would be really curious to take 10 breached companies that are publicly traded, look at that stock dip, but then compare them to what other companies in the same field did, adjusted for price to earnings, adjusted for other factors. Because Josh, I don't know that I understand why you said what you said, and I understand why people are flip about it, but I don't think anyone's actually done that math, and I'm going to look and find out, and if they haven't, I'm going to do it. Because that to me is a really interesting discussion about long-term value as adjusted to, yeah, maybe their stock goes up eventually, but could it have gone up more? Did your competitors go up more? Right now we're balancing macroeconomic factors. And when I said I'm going to do it, I mean, I'm going to find an economist to do it. But like, I am genuinely curious about that, because I do think that there's a there. And I'd be really curious to have that discussion. So we talked a lot about a lot of things here, but I want to thank you, gentlemen, for coming and participating. And I really do think that this was an interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you, everybody.